Hi. There's Ace. Happy Sunday. We are repping the Jays shirt. Unfortunately, they didn't win. It is what it is. We are continuing on with H.P. Lovecraft's Necronomicon. I mean, it's not very far from Halloween now, so we might as well. And yesterday, we started The Shadow over Innsmouth. Someone corrected me. They told me that it's Innsmouth, not Innsmouth. So why did he spell it that way? But whatever. The Shadow over Innsmouth. And there's only 3 parts left. 3, 4, 5. We were just going to do 3 and 4 today. But part 5 is like a page and a half. So I think we're just going to power through the whole thing. Unless my phone dies. And in that case, we'll do what we can. So, without further ado, we will begin on part 3. It must have been some imp of the perverse, great start. It must have been some imp of the perverse, or some sardonic pull from dark hidden sources, which made me change my plans as I did. I had long before resolved to limit my observations to architecture alone, and I was even then hurrying towards the square in an effort to get quick transportation out of this festering city of death and decay. But the sight of old Zadok Allen set up new currents in my mind and made me slacken my pace uncertainly. I had been assured that the old man could do nothing but hint at wild, disjointed, and incredible legends, and I had been warned that the native made it unsafe to be seen talking with him. Yet, the thought of this aged witness to the town's decay, with memories going back to the early days of ships and factories, was a lure that no amount of reason could make me resist. After all, the strangest and maddest of myths are often merely symbols or allegories based upon truth, and old Zadok must have seen everything which went on around Innsmouth for the last 90 years. Curiosity flared up beyond sense and caution, and in my youthful egotism, I fancied I might be able to sift a nucleus of real history from the confused, extravagant outpouring I would probably extract with the aid of raw whiskey. I knew that I could not accost him then and there, for the firemen would surely notice and object. Instead, I reflected, I would prepare by getting some bootleg liquor at a place where the grocery boy had told me it was plentiful. Then I would loaf near the fire station in apparent casualness and fall in with old Zadok after he had started on one of his frequent rambles. The youth had said that he was very restless, seldom sitting around the station for more than an hour or 2 at a time. A quart bottle of whiskey was easily, though not cheaply, obtained in the rear of a dingy variety store just off the square in Elliott Street. The dirty-looking fellow who waited on me had a touch of the starting Innsmouth look, but was quite civil in his way, being perhaps used to the custom of such convivial strangers, truckmen, gold buyers, and the like, as were occasionally in town. Re-entering the square, I saw that luck was with me, for, shuffling out of Payne Street around the corner of the Gilman house, I glimpsed nothing less than the tall, lean, tattered form of old Zadok Allen himself. In accordance with my plan, I attracted his attention by brandishing my newly purchased bottle, and soon realized that he had begun to shuffle wistfully after me as I turned into Waite Street on my way to the most deserted region I could think of. I was steering my course by the map the grocery boy had prepared, and was aiming for the wholly abandoned stretch of southern waterfront which I had previously visited. The only people in sight there had been the fishermen on the distant breakwater, and, by going a few squares south, I could get beyond the range of these, finding a pair of seats on some abandoned wharf and being free to question old Zadok unobserved for an indefinite time. Before I reached Main Street, I could hear a faint and wheezy, "Hey, mister," behind me, and I presently allowed the old man to catch up and take copious pulls from the quart bottle. I began putting out feelers as we walked amidst the omnipresent desolation and crazily tilted ruins, but found that the aged tongue did not loosen as quickly as I had expected. At length, I saw a grass-grown opening towards the sea between crumbling brick walls, with the weedy length of an earth and masonry wharf projecting beyond. Piles of moss-covered stones near the water promised tolerable seats, and the scene was sheltered from all possible view by a ruined warehouse on the north. Here, I thought, was the ideal place for a long, secret colloquy, so I guided my companion down the lane and picked out spots to sit in among the mossy stones. The air of death and desertion was ghoulish, and the smell of fish almost insufferable, but I was resolved to let nothing deter me. My hair does not look good. We're pausing for a minute. And honestly, there's nothing that looks the way that pushing your hair back with sunglasses or glasses does. So this is what we're doing right now because I'm not loving how it's falling. About 4 hours remained for conversation if I were to catch the 8 o'clock coach for Arkham. About 4 hours remained for conversation if I were to catch the 8 o'clock coach for Arkham, and I began to dole out more liquor to the ancient tippler, meanwhile eating my own frugal lunch. In my donations, I was careful not to overshoot the mark, for I did not wish Zadok's vinous garrulousness to pass into a stupor. After an hour, his furtive taciturnity showed signs of disappearing, but much to my disappointment, he still sidetracked my questions about Innsmouth and its shadow-haunted past. He would babble of current topics, revealing a wide acquaintance with newspapers and a great tendency to philosophize in a sententious village fashion. Towards the end of the second hour, I feared my quart of whiskey would not be enough to produce results, and was wondering whether I had better leave old Zadok and go back for more. Just then, however, chance made the opening which my questions had been unable to make, and the wheezing ancient's rambling took a turn that caused me to lean forward and listen alertly. My back was towards the fishy-smelling sea, but he was facing it, and something or other had caused his wandering gaze to light on the low, distant line of Devil Reef, then showing plainly and almost fascinatingly above the waves. The sight seemed to displease him, for he began a series of weak curses which ended in a confidential whisper and a knowing leer. He bent towards me, took hold of my coat lapel, and hissed out some hints that could not be mistaken. That's where it all began, that cursed place of all wickedness where the deep water starts. Gates of hell, sheer drop down to the bottom no sound and line can catch. Old Captain Obed done it, him that found out morn was good for him in the South Sea Islands. Oh, this is going to be another one where it's written the way he speaks and it's hard for me to read. So bear with me. Everybody was in a bad way them days. Trade falling off, mills losing business, even the new ones. And the best of our men folks killed to privateering in the War of 1812 or lost with the Elysie brig and the Ranger scow, both of them Gilman ventures. Obed Marsh had had 3 ships afloat, Brigantine Columbia, Brig Hetty, and bark Sumatra Queen. He was the only one as keep on with the East Indian Pacific trade, though Esdras Martin's barkentine Malay Bride made a venture as late as 28. Never was nobody like Captain Obed, old Lima Satan. I can mind him a-tellin' about furrin parts and callin' all the folks stupid for going to Christian meetin' and bearin' their burdens meek and lowly. Says they'd orter get better gods like some of the folks in the Ingies. Gods as 'd bring 'em good fishin' in return for the sacrifices and 'd really answer for folks' prayers. Matt Elliott, his first mate, talked a lot too, only he was agin' folks doing any heathen things. Told about an island east of Otaheite, where they was a lot of stone ruins older than anybody knew anything about, kinda like them on Penape in the Carolines, but with carvings of faces that looked like the big statues on Easter Island. There was a little volcanic island near there too, where there was other ruins with different carvings. Ruins all wore away like they'd been under the sea once, and with pictures of awful monsters all over 'em. Well, sir, Matt, he says the natives around there had all the fish they could catch and sported bracelets and armlets and head rigs made out of a queer kind of gold and covered with pictures of monsters, just like the ones carved over the ruins on the just like the ones carved over the ruins on the little island. Sort of fish like frogs or frog like fish that was drawed in all kinds of positions like they was human beings. Nobody could get out of them where they got all this stuff. and all the other natives wondered how they managed to find fish in plenty, even when the very next islands had lean pickings. Matt he got to wondering too, and so did Captain Obed. Obed, he notices, besides, that lots of the handsome young folks would drop out of sight for good from year to year, and that they wasn't many old folks around. Also, he thinks some of the folks looked darned queer even for Kanakees. Oh my goodness. I'm gonna take a sip of water. It's like, it's fun. It's fun when it's written the way that they speak, but it's hard to know what they're saying. So I would rather that not be the case, but it is what it is. It took Obed to get the truth out of them heathen. I don't know how he done it, but he began by trading for the gold-like things they wore. Asked them where they come from, and if they could get more, and finally wormed the story out of the chief. Wallachia, they call him. Nobody but Obed had ever believed the old yeller devil, but the captain could read folks like they was books. Nobody never believes me now when I tell him, and I don't suppose you will, young feller. Though come to look at you have kind of got them sharp reading eyes like Obed had. The old man's whisper grew fainter, and I found myself shuddering at the terrible and sincere portentousness of his intonation, even though I knew his tale could be nothing but drunken fantasy. Well, sir, Obed, he learnt that they's things on this earth as most folks never heard about, and wouldn't believe if they did hear. It seems these Kanakees was sacrificing heaps of their young men and maidens to some kind of god things that lived under the sea, and getting all kinds of favor in return. They met the things on the little islet with the queer ruins, and it seems them awful pictures of frog-fish monsters was supposed to be pictures of these things. Maybe they was the kind of critters as got all the mermaid stories and such started. They had all kinds of cities on the sea bottom, and this island was heaved up from there. Seems they was some of the things alive in the stone buildings when the island come up sudden to the surface. That's how the Kanakees got wind they was down there. Made sign talk as soon as they got over being scared, and pieced up a bargain afore long. Them things liked human sacrifices. Had 'em ages afore, but lost track of the upper world after a time. What they done to the victims, it ain't for me to say, and I guess Obed wasn't none too sharp about asking. But it was all right with the heathens, because they'd been having a hard time and was desperate about everything. They give a starting number of young folk to the sea things twice every year, May Eve and Halloween, regular as could be. Also give some of the carved knickknacks they made. What the things agreed to give in return was plenty of fish. They druv 'em in from all over the sea, and a few gold-like things now and then. Well, as I says, the natives met the things on the little volcanic islet, going there in canoes with the sacrifices, etc., and bringing back any of the gold-like jewels as was coming to 'em. And first, the things didn't never go on the main island, but after a time, they come to want to. Seems they hankered arter mixing with them folks and having gint ceremonies on the big days, May Eve and Halloween. You see, they was able to live both in and out of water, what they call amphibians, I guess. Oh, fuck. There's like 3 more pages of just this. Oh my god! Okay. Fuck. Let's get into it. The Kanakees told him as how folks from the other islands might want to wipe 'em out if they got wind of their being there, but they says they don't care much because they could wipe out the whole brood of humans if they was willing to bother. That is, any as didn't have starting signs such as was used once by the lost ones, whoever they was. But not wanting to bother, they'd lay low when anybody visited the island. When it come to mating with them toad-looking fishes, the Kanakees kind of balked. But finally, they learnt something as put a new face on the matter. Seems that human folks has got a kind of relation to such water beasts, that everything alive come out of the water once, and only needs a little change to go back again. Them things told the Kanakees that if they mixed bloods, there'd be children as would look human at first, but later turn more and more like the things, till finally they'd take to the water and join the main lot of things down there. And this is the important part, young feller. Them as turned into fish things and went into the water wouldn't never die. Them things never died except they was killed violent. Well, sir, It seems by the time Obed knowed them islanders, they was all full of fish blood from them deep water things. When they got old and begun to show it, they was kept hid until they felt like taking to the water and quitting the place. Some was more tetched than others, and some never did change quite enough to take to the water, but mostly they turned out just the way them things said. Them as was born more like the things changed early, but them as was nearly human sometimes stayed on the island till they was past 70, though they'd usually go down under for trial trips afore that. Folks as had took to the water generally come back a good deal to visit, so's a man 'ud often be a-talking to his own 5 times great-grandfather who'd left the dry land a couple of 100 years or so afore. Everybody got out of the idea dying, except in canoe wars with the other islanders, or as sacrifices to the sea gods down below, or from snakebite, or plague, or sharp galloping ailments, or something afore they could take to the water, but simply looked forward to a kind of change that wasn't a bit horrible after a while. They thought what they'd got was well with all they'd had to give up, and I'd guess Obed kind of come to think the same himself when he'd chewed over old Wallachia story a bit. Wallachia, though, was one of the few as hadn't got none of the fish blood, being of a royal line that intermarried with royal lines on other islands. Wallachia, he showed Obed a lot of rites and incantations as had to do with the sea things, and let him see some of the folks in the villages had changed a lot from human shape. Somehow or other, though, he would never let him see one of the regular things from right out of the water. In the end, he gave him a funny kind of thingamajig, made out of lead or something, that he said'd bring up the fish things from any place in the water where there might be a nest of 'em. The idea was to drop it down with the right kind of prayers and such. Wallachia allowed as the thins was scattered all over the world, so as anybody that looked about could find a nest and bring 'em up as if they wanted. Matt, he didn't like this business at all, and wanted Obed should keep him away from the island. But the captain was sharp for gain, and found he could get them gold-like things so cheap, it'd pay him to make a specialty of 'em. Things went on that way for years, and Obed got enough of that gold-like stuff to make him start the refinery and Waite's old run-down fullin' mill. He didn't dast sell the pieces like they was, for folks would be all the time asking questions. All the same, his crews would get a piece and dispose of it now and then, even though they swore to keep quiet, and he let his women folks wear some of the pieces, as was more human-like than most. Well, come about 38, when I was 7 years old, Obed, he found the island people all wiped out between voyages. Seems the other islanders had got wind of what was going on, and had took matters into their own hands. Suppose they must had, after all, them old magic signs as the sea things says was the only things they was afraid of. No tellin' what any of 'em Kanakis will chance to get a holt of when the sea bottom throws up some island with ruins older than the deluge. Pious cusses these was. They didn't leave nothin' standin' on either the main island or the little volcanic islet, except what parts of the ruins was too big to knock down. In some places, they was little stones strewed about, like charms, with somethin' on 'em like what you call a swastika nowadays. Probably them was the old ones' signs. Folks all wiped out, no trace of the gold-like things, and none of the nearby Kanakis would breathe a word about the matter. Wouldn't even admit they'd ever been any people on that island. That naturally hit Obed pretty hard, seeing as his normal trade was doing very poor. It hit the whole of Innsmouth, too, because in seafaring days, what profited the master of a ship generally profited the crew proportionate. Most of the folks around the town took the hard times kind of sheep-like and resigned, but they was in a bad shape because the fishing was peterin' out and the mills wasn't doing none too well. Then's the time Obed he begun a-cursin' at the folks for being dull sheep and prayin' to a Christian heaven as didn't help him none. He told him he'd knowed of folks as prayed to gods that give something you really need, and says if a bunch of good men'd stand by him, he could maybe get hold of startin' powers as'd bring plenty of fish and quite a bit of gold. Of course, them as served on the Sumatry Queen and seed the island knowed what he meant, and wasn't none too anxious to get close to see things like they'd heard tell on, But them as didn't know what was all about got kind of swayed by what Obed had to say, and begun to ask him what he could do to set him on the way to the faith as would bring him results. Here the old man faltered, mumbled, and lapsed into a moody, apprehensive silence, glancing nervously over his shoulder, and then turning back to stare fascinatedly at the distant black reef. When I spoke to him, he did not answer, so I knew I would have to let him finish the bottle. The insane yarn I was hearing interested me profoundly, for I fancied there was contained within it a sort of crude allegory based upon the strangeness of Innsmouth, and elaborated by an imagination at once creative and full of scraps of exotic legend. Not for a moment did I believe that the tale had any real substantial foundation, but nonetheless, the account held a hint of genuine terror, if only because it brought in references to strange jewels clearly akin to the malign tiara I had seen at Newburyport. Perhaps the ornaments had, after all, come from some strange island, and possibly the wild stories were lies of the bygone Obed himself rather than of this antique topper. I handed Zadok the bottle, and he drained it to the last drop. It was curious how he could stand so much whiskey, for not even a trace of thickness had come into his high, wheezy voice. He licked the nose of the bottle and slipped it into his pocket, then, beginning to nod and whisper softly to himself. I bent close to catch any articulate words he might utter, and thought I saw a sardonic smile behind the stained behind the stained, bushy whiskers. Yes, he really was forming words, and I could grasp a fair proportion of them. Poor Matt. Alice was agin it. I don't know what that means. Poor Matt, he always was against it, tried to line up the folks on his side, and had long talks with the preachers, no use. They run the Congregational parson about the town, and the Methodist feller quit. Never did see resolved Babcock, the Baptist parson again. Wrath of Jehovah. I was a mighty little critter, but I heard what I heard and seen what I seen. Dagon, and Ashtoreth, Belial and Belial and Beelzebub, golden calf, and the idols of Canaan, and the Philistines, Babylonish abominations, Mene, Tekel, Aparshan. He stopped again, and from the look in his watery blue eyes, I feared he was close to a stupor after all. But when I gently shook his shoulder, he turned on me with astonishing alertness and snapped out some more obscure phrases. Don't believe me, hey? Then, just tell me, young fellow, why Captain Obed and 20-odd other folk used to row out to the Devil Reef in the dead of night and chant things so loud you could hear 'em all over town when the wind was right. Tell me that, eh? And tell me why Obed was always dropping heavy things down in the deep water to the other side of the reef where the bottom shoots down like a cliff lower than you can sound. Tell me what he done with that funny-shaped lead thingamajig as Wallachia give him. Hey, boy? And what did they all howl on May Eve, and again the next Halloween? And why'd the new church parsons, fellers as used to be sailors, wear them queer robes and cover theirselves with them gold-like things Obed brung, eh? The watery blue eyes were almost savage and maniacal now, and the dirty white beard bristled electrically. Old Zadok probably saw me shrink back, for he began to cackle evilly. Beginning to see, hey? Maybe you'd like to have been me in them days, when I seed things at night out to sea from the cupola top of my house. Oh, I can tell you little pitchers have big ears, and I wouldn't admit nothing of what was gossiped about Captain Obed and the folks out to the reef. How about that night I took my pa's ship's glass up to the cupola and seed the reef a bristling thick with shapes that dived off quick soon's the moon riz. You know what? It must be more difficult to write like this. It would take a lot longer to sound out exactly how each word would say. And I get it adds to the atmosphere, but it makes it so hard to read aloud. So thanks for hanging in there with me. Obed and the folks was in a dory, but them ships dived off the far side into the deep water and never come up. How'd you like to be a little shaver alone up in a cupola, watching shapes as wasn't human shapes? Hey? The old man was getting hysterical, and I began to shiver with a nameless alarm. He laid a gnarled claw on my shoulder, and it seemed to me that its shaking was not altogether that of mirth. Suppose one night you seed something heavy-headed off an Obed's dory beyond the reef, and then learn next day a young feller was missing from home. Hey? Did anybody ever see hide or hair of Hiram Gilman again? Did they? And Nick Pierce, and Llewellyn Waite, and Adoniram Southwick, and Henry Garrison. Hey? Shapes talk and sign language with their hands, them as had real hands. Well, sir, that was the time Obed begun to get on his feet again. Folks see his 3 daughters a-wearing gold-like things as nobody'd never seen on 'em afore, and smoke started coming out of the refinery chimney. Says chimbley, but I think it's chimney. Other folks was prospering too. Fish begun to swarm into the harbor fit to kill, and heaven knows what sized cargoes we begun to ship up about Newburyport, Arkham, and Boston. 'Twas then Obed got the old branch railroad put through. Some Kingsport fishermen heard about the catch and come up in sloops, but they was all lost. Nobody never see 'em again. And just then our folks organized the Esoteric Order of Dagon and bought Masonic Hall often cavalry commandery for it. Matt Elliott was a Mason and age in the sellin', but he dropped out the sight just then. Remember, I ain't saying Obed was set on heaven things just like they was on that Kanaki Isle. I don't think he aimed at first to do no mixin', nor raise no young'uns to take to the water and turn into fishes with eternal life. He wanted them gold things and was willin' to pay heavy, and I guess the others was satisfied for a while. Come in 46, the town done some lookin' and thinkin' for itself. Too many folks missin', too much wild preachin' at meetin' of a Sunday, too much talk about that reef. I guess I done a bit by tellin' Selectman Mowry what I see from the cupola. There was a party one night as follered Obed's crowd out to the reef, and I heard shots betwixt the dories. Next day, Obed and 32 others was in jail, with everybody a-wonderin' just what was afoot, and just what charge against 'em could be got to hold. God, if anybody'd look ahead. A couple of weeks later, when nothing had been thrown into the sea for that long, Zadok was showing signs of fright. God, it just is going. Okay, we are almost done part 3, and then my frustration will be done. And hopefully so will Zadok Allen. It's great, and it's awesome, and it's informative, but I just don't like how it's written. It's very hard to read aloud. Zadok was showing signs of fright and exhaustion, and I let him keep silent for a while, though glancing apprehensively at my watch. The tide had turned and was coming in now, and the sound of the waves seemed to arouse him. I was glad of that tide, for at high water the fishy smell might not be so bad. Again, I strained to catch his whispers. That awful night. I seed 'em. I was up in the cupola. Hordes of 'em. Swarms of 'em. All over the reef and swimming up the harbor into the Manixet. God, what happened in the streets of Innsmouth that night? They rattled our door, but Pa wouldn't open. Then he clubbed out the kitchen winder with his musket and Mowry and see what he could do. Mounds of the dead and the dyin', shots and screams, shouting in Old Square and Town Square and New Church Garden. Jail throat open, proclamation, treason, called it the plague when folks come in and found half our people missing. Nobody left but them as they'd join in with Obed and them things or else keep quiet. Never heard him upon no more. The old man was panting and perspiring profusely. His grip on my shoulder tightened. Everything cleaned up in the morning, but they was traces. Obed, he kinder takes charge and says things is going to be changed. Others'll worship with us at meeting time. And startin' houses has got to entertain guests. They wanted to mix like they done with the Kanakis, and he, for one, didn't feel bound to stop 'em. Far gone was Obed, just like a crazy man on the subject. He says they brung us fish and treasure and should have what they hankered after. Nothing was to be different on the outside, only we was to keep shy of strangers if we knowed what was good for us. We all had to take the oath of Dagon, and later on they was second and third oaths that some on us took. Them as 'd help special 'd get special rewards, gold and such. No use balkin', for they was millions of 'em down there. They'd rather not start rising and wiping out humankind, but if they was give away and forced to, they could do a lot towards just that. We didn't have them old charms to cut 'em off like the folks in the South Sea did, and them Kanakis wouldn't never give away their secrets. Yelled up enough sacrifices and savage knickknacks and harborage in the town when they wanted it, and they'd let well enough alone. Wouldn't bother no strangers as might bear tales outside, that is, without they got pryin'. All in the band of the faithful, order a Dagon, and the children should never die, but go back to the Mother Hydra and Father Dagon, what we all come from once. And it's the Cthulhu chant. Ida, Ida, Cthulhu Fagin. Fignuli, Mlagwa, Cthulhu Rile, Waga, Nal, Taga. You know, I should just know it by now because of how many times I've had to do that. Old Zadok was fast lapsing into stark raving, and I held my breath. Poor old soul. To what pitiful depths of hallucination had his liquor, plus his hatred of the decay, alienage, and disease around him, brought that fertile, imaginative brain? He began to moan now, and tears were coursing down his channeled cheeks into the depths of his beard. God, what I seen sankt I was 15-year-old. Mene, Tekel, Aparshin. The folks as was missin', as them as kilt theirselves. Them as told things in Arkham or Ipswich or sich places was all called crazy, like you're calling me right now. But God, what I seen. They had kilt me long ago for what I know, only I took the first and second oaths of Dagon off an Obed. So was protected unless a jury of 'em proved I told things known and deliberate. But I wouldn't take the third oath. I'd have died rather than take it. I got wis around Civil War time, when children born sankt 46 begun to grow up. Some of 'em, that is. I was afeared, never did no pryin' after that awful night, and never seen one of them close to in all my life. That is, never no full-blooded one. I went to the war, and if I'd had any guts or sense, I'd have never come back, but settled away from here. But folks wrote me things wasn't so bad. That, I suppose, was because government draftmen was in town after 63. After the war, it was just as bad again. People begun to fall off. Mills and shops shut down. Shipping stopped and the harbor choked up. Railroad gave up. But they never stopped swimming in and out of the river from that cursed reef of Satan. And more attic winders got aboarded up, windows, more and more attic windows got boarded up, and more noises was heard in houses, and that wasn't supposed to have nobody in 'em. Folks outside have their stories about us. Suppose you've heard a plenty on 'em, seeing what questions you asked. Stories about things they've seen now and then, and about that queer jewelry as still comes in from somewheres and ain't quite all melted up. But nothing never gets definite. Nobody'll believe nothin'. They call them gold-like things pirate loot, and allow the Innsmouth folks has furrin blood or is distempered or something. Foreign blood. It's distempered or something. Besides, them that lives here shoot off as many strangers as they can and encourage the rest not to get very curious, especially around nighttime. Beasts balk at the critters. Hosses, wuss, and mules. I don't know what that means. Beasts balk at the critters, hosses, wuss, and mules, but when they got autos, that was all right. I'm going to take a sip of water. It's also really hot in here. Really hot. It's obviously because I'm sitting directly in the sun. In 46, Captain Obed took a second wife that nobody in the town never see. Some says he didn't want to, but was made to by them as he'd called in. Had 3 children by her. 2 as disappeared young, but one gal as looked like anybody else and was educated in Europe. Obed finally got her married off by a trick to an Arkham feller and just didn't suspect nothing. But nobody outside'll have nothing to do with Innsmouth folk now. Barnabas Marsh, that runs the refinery now, was Obed's grandson by his first wife. Son of one Sypharis, his eldest son, but his mother was another of them, as one never seen outdoors. Right now, Barnabas is about changed. Can't shut his eye no more and is all out of shape. They say he still wears clothes, but he'll take to the water soon. Maybe he's tried it already. They do sometimes go down for little spells afore they go down for good. Ain't been seen about in public for nigh on 10 years. Don't know how his poor wife can feel. She come from Ipswich, and they nigh lynched Barnabas when he courted her 50 odd years ago. Obed died in 78, and all the next generation is gone now. The first wife's children dead, and the rest, God knows. The sound of the incoming tide was now very insistent, and little by little it seemed to change the old man's mood to watch. He would pause now and then to renew those nervous glances over his shoulder or out towards the reef, and despite the wild absurdity of his tale, I could not help beginning to share his vague apprehensiveness. Zadok now grew shriller and seemed to be trying to whip up his courage with louder speech. "Hey you, why don't you say something? How'd you like to be living in a town like this, with everything a-rottin' and a-dyin', and boarded-up monsters crawling and bleating and barking and hopping around black cellars and attics everywhere you turn? Hey? How'd you like to hear the howlin' night after night from the churches in order of Dagon Hall, and knowin' what's doin' part of the howlin'? How'd you like to hear what comes from that awful reef every May Eve and Hallowmass? Hey? Think the old man's crazy, eh? Well, sir, let me tell you, that ain't the worst." Zadok was really screaming now, and the mad frenzy of his voice disturbed me more than I cared to own. "Kersey, don't sit that a-staring at me with them eyes. I tell Obed Marsh he's in hell, and he's got to stay there. In hell, I says. Can't get me. I ain't done nothin' nor told nobody nothin'." "Oh, you young feller. Well, even if I hain't told nobody nothin' yet, I'm a-goin' to now. You'll just set still and listen to me, boy. This is what I ain't never told nobody. I says I didn't get to do no pryin' after that night, but I found things out just the same. You want to know what the real horror is, hey? Well, it's this. It ain't what them fish devils has done, but what they're goin' to do. They were bringin' things up out of the water when they come in from the town. Been doing it for years and slackening up lately. Them houses north of the river, betwixt water and Main Streets, is full of 'em. Them devils and what they brung, and when they get ready, I say, when they get ready. Ever hear tell of a Shoggoth?" Yeah, he's back. "Hey, do you hear me? I tell you, I know what them things be. I seen 'em one night when, ah! He's just yelling. The hideous suddenness and inhuman frightfulness of the old man's shriek almost made me faint. His eyes, looking past me towards the malodorous sea, were positively starting from his head, while his face was a mask of fear worthy of Greek tragedy. His bony claw dug monstrously into my shoulder, and he made no motion as I turned my head to look at whatever he had glimpsed. There was nothing that I could see. Only the incoming tide, with perhaps one set of ripples more local than the long-flung line of breakers. But now Zadok was shaking me, and I turned back to watch the melting of that near-frozen face into a chaos of twitching eyelids and mumbling gums. Presently, his voice came back, albeit as a trembling whisper. "Get out of here. Get out of here. They seen us. Get out for your life. Don't wait for nothin'. They know now. Run for it. Quick. Out of this town." Another heavy wave dashed against the loosening masonry of the bygone wharf and changed the mad ancient's whisper to another inhuman and blood-curdling scream. You can picture it. I'm not going to do it. Before I could recover my scattered wits, he had relaxed his clutch on my shoulder and dashed wildly inland towards the street, reeling northwards around the ruined warehouse wall. I glanced back at the sea, but there was nothing there. And when I reached Water Street, I looked along it towards the north. There was no remaining trace of Zadok Allen. That was part 3. Thank you for remaining with me as I bumbled through all of Zadok's story. I hope the gist was still there. Clearly I find it kind of frustrating when it's written like that. Though it is fun, it's very hard to read aloud. So part 4. I can hardly describe the mood in which I was left by this harrowing episode. An episode at once mad and pitiful, grotesque and terrifying. The grocery boy had prepared me for it, yet the reality left me none the less bewildered and disturbed. Puerile though the story was, old Zadok's insane earnestness and horror had communicated to me a mounting unrest which joined with my earlier sense of loathing for the town and its blight of intangible shadow. Later, I might sift the tale and extract some nucleus of historic allegory. Just now, I wished to put it out of my head. The hour had grown perilously late. My watch said 7:15, and the Arkham bus left Town Square at 8. So I tried to give my thoughts as neutral and practical a cast as possible, meanwhile walking rapidly through the deserted streets of gaping roofs and leaning houses toward the hotel where I had checked my valise and would find my bus. Hi. Though the golden light of late afternoon gave the ancient roofs and decrepit chimneys an air of mystic loveliness and peace, I could not help glancing over my shoulder now and then. I would surely be very glad to get out of malodorous and fear-shadowed Innsmouth, and wished there were some other vehicle than the bus driven by that sinister-looking fellow sergeant. Yet I did not hurry too precipitately, for there were architectural details worth viewing at every silent corner, and I could easily, I calculated, cover the necessary distance in a half hour. Let me take a sip of water, just kind of reset because I'm making a couple mistakes. Just fine, I'm human. And we're reading this for the first time together. Studying the grocery youth's map and seeking a route I had not traversed before, I chose Marsh Street instead of State for my approach to Town Square. Is this his map? Is this his map? Whenever I first started, this is just Arkham. No, it's not. It's not his map because he's in Innsmouth. So, yeah, okay, it's not his map. Okay, anyways. Studying the grocery youth's map and seeking a route I had not traversed before, I chose Marsh Street instead of State for my approach to Town Square. Near the corner of Fall Street, I began to see scattered groups of furtive whispers, and when I finally reached the square, I saw that almost all the loiterers were congregated around the door of the Gilman house. It seemed as if many bulging, watery, unwinking eyes looked oddly at me as I claimed my valise in the lobby, and I hoped that none of these unpleasant creatures would be my fellow passengers on the coach. The bus, rather early, rattled in with 3 passengers somewhat before 8, and an evil-looking fellow on the sidewalk muttered a few indistinguishable words to the driver. I also hope there's treasure on the map. How fun would that be? Sergeant threw out a mailbag and a roll of newspapers and entered the hotel. Meanwhile, the passengers, the same men whom I had seen arriving in Newburyport that morning, shambled to the sidewalk and exchanged some faint guttural words with a loafer in a language I could have sworn was not English. I boarded the empty coach and took the same seat I had taken before, but was hardly settled before Sergeant reappeared and began mumbling in a throaty voice of peculiar repulsiveness. I was, it appeared, in very bad luck. There had been something wrong with the engine, despite the excellent time made from Newburyport, and the bus could not complete the journey to Arkham. No, it could not possibly be repaired that night, nor was there any other way of getting transportation out of Innsmouth, either to Arkham or elsewhere. Sergeant was sorry, but I would have to stop over at the Gilman. Probably the clerk would make the price easy for me, but there was nothing else to do. Almost dazed by this sudden obstacle, and violently dreading the fall of night in this decaying and half-unlighted town, I took the bus and re-entered the hotel, or I left the bus and re-entered the hotel lobby, where the sullen, queer-looking night clerk told me I could have room 428 on the next top floor. Where the sullen, queer-looking night clerk told me I could have room 428 on next the top floor, large but without running water, for $1. Sorry, just have to sound things out sometimes. Despite what I had heard of this hotel in Newburyport, I signed the register, paid my $1, let the clerk take my valise, and followed that sour, solitary attendant up 3 creaking flights of stairs past dusty corridors which seemed wholly devoid of life. My room, a dismal rear one with 2 windows and bare, cheap furnishings, overlooked a dingy courtyard otherwise hemmed in by low, deserted brick blocks, and commanded a view of decrepit westward stretching roofs with a marshy countryside beyond. At the end of the corridor was a bathroom, a discouraging relic with ancient marble bowl, a tin tub, faint electric light, and musty wooden paneling all around the plumbing fixtures. It being still daylight, I descended to the square and looked around for a dinner of some sort, noticing as I did so the strange glances I received from the unwholesome loafers. Since the grocery was closed, I was forced to patronize the restaurant I had shunned before. A stooped, narrow-headed man with staring, unwinking eyes and a flat-nosed wench with unbelievably thick, clumsy hands being in attendance. The service was all of the counter type, and it relieved me to find that much was evidently served from cans and packages. A bowl of vegetable soup with crackers was enough for me, and I soon headed back for my cheerless room at the Gilman, getting an evening paper and a fly-specked magazine from the evil-visaged clerk at the rickety stand beside his desk. As twilight deepened, I turned on the one feeble electric bulb over the cheap iron-framed bed and tried as best I could to continue the reading I had begun. I felt it advisable to keep my mind wholesomely occupied, for it would not do to brood over the abnormalities of this ancient, blight-shadowed town while I was still within its borders. The insane yarn I had heard from the aged drunkard did not promise very pleasant dreams, and I felt I must keep the image of his wild, watery eyes as far as possible from my imagination. Also, I must not dwell on what that factory inspector had told the Newburyport ticket agent about the Gilman house, on that, or on the face beneath the tiara in the black church doorway, the face for whose horror my conscious mind could not account. It would perhaps have been easier to keep my thoughts from disturbing topics had the room not been so gruesomely musty. As it was, the lethal mustiness blended hideously with the town's general fishy odor and persistently focused one's fancy on death and decay. Keeps mentioning the fishy odor of the town, which would be horrible. Another thing that disturbed me was the absence of a bolt on the door of my room. One had been there, as marks clearly showed, but there were signs of recent removal. No doubt it had become out of order, like so many other things in this decrepit edifice. In my nervousness, I looked around and discovered a bolt on the clothes press, which seemed to be of the same size, judging from the marks, as the one formerly on the door. To gain a partial relief from the general tension, I busied myself by transferring this hardware to the vacant place with the aid of a handy 3-in-1 device, including a screwdriver which I kept on my keyring. The bolt fitted perfectly, and I was somewhat relieved when I knew I could shoot it firmly upon retiring. Not that I had any real apprehension of its need, but that any symbol of security was welcome in an environment of this kind. There were adequate bolts on the 2 lateral doors to connecting rooms, and these I proceeded to fashion. I did not undress, but decided to read till I was sleepy, and then lie down with only my coat, collar, and shoes off. Taking a pocket flashlight from my valise, I placed it in my trousers, so that I could read my watch if I woke up later in the dark. Drowsiness, however, did not come, and when I stopped to analyze my thoughts, I found to my disquiet that I was really unconsciously listening for something which I dreaded but could not name. That inspector's story must have worked on my imagination more deeply than I had suspected. Again, I tried to read, but found that I made no progress. After a time, I seemed to hear the stairs and corridors creak at intervals, as if with footsteps, and wondered if the other rooms were beginning to fill up. There were no voices, however, and it struck me that there was something subtly furtive about the creaking. I did not like it, and debated whether I had better try to sleep at all. The town had some queer people, and there had undoubtedly been several disappearances. Was this one of those inns where travelers were slain for their money? Surely I had no look of excessive prosperity. Or were the townsfolk really so resentful about curious visitors? Had my obvious sightseeing, with its frequent map consultations, aroused unfavorable notice? It occurred to me that I must be in a highly nervous state to let a few random creakings set me off speculating in this fashion, but I regretted none the less that I was unarmed. At length, feeling a fatigue which had nothing of drowsiness in it, I bolted the newly outfitted hall door, turned off the light, and threw myself down on the hard, uneven bed, coat, collar, shoes, and all. In the darkness, every faint noise of the night seemed magnified, and a flood of doubly unpleasant thoughts swept over me. I was sorry I had put out the light, yet was too tired to rise and turn it on again. Then, after a long, dreary interval, and prefaced by a fresh creaking of stairs and corridor, there came that soft, damnably unmistakable sound which seemed like a malign fulfillment of all my apprehensions. Without the least shadow of a doubt, the lock of my door was being tried, cautiously, furtively, tentatively, with a key. Spooky! I just have to adjust. I need a better chair. Apparently, I need a better chair. Okay. My sensations upon recognizing the sign of actual peril were perhaps less rather than more tumultuous because of my previous vague fears. I had been, albeit without definite reason, instinctively on my guard, and that was to my advantage in the new and real crisis, whatever it might turn out to be. Nevertheless, the change in the menace from vague premonition to immediate reality was a profound shock, and fell upon me with the force of a genuine blow. It never once occurred to me that the fumbling might be a mere mistake. Malign purpose was all I could think of, and I kept deathly quiet, awaiting the would-be intruder's next move. After a time, the cautious rattling ceased, and I heard the room to the north entered with a passkey. Then the lock of the connecting door to my room was softly tried. The bolt held, of course, and I heard the floor creak as the prowler left the room. After a moment, there came another soft rattling, and I knew that the room to the south of me was being entered. Again, a furtive trying of a bolted connecting door, and again a receding creaking. This time, the creaking went along the hall and down the stairs, so I knew that the prowler had realized the bolted condition of my doors, and was giving up his attempt for a greater or lesser time, as the future would show. I don't actually think there was anything wrong with the engine on the bus. I think he's right. I think they were for sure going to sacrifice him. They probably just, because nobody ever, what is going on here? Because nobody ever visits in Innsmouth. So they for sure are just sacrificing tourists. Spooky. Always lock your hotel doors. Always lock all your doors. The readiness with which I fell into a plan of action proves that I must have been subconsciously fearing sub-menace and considering possible avenues of escape for hours. From the first, I felt that the unseen fumbler meant a danger not to be met with or dealt with, but only to be fled from as precipitately as possible. The one thing to do was to get out of that hotel alive as quickly as I could, and through some channel other than the front stairs or lobby. Rising softly and throwing my flashlight on the switch, I sought to light the bulb over my bed in order to choose and pocket some belongings for a swift, valiseless flight. Nothing, however, happened, and I saw that the power had been cut off. Good thing he put the flashlight in his pocket. Clearly, some cryptic, evil movement was afoot on a large scale. Just what, I could not say. As I stood pondering with my hand on the now useless switch, I heard a muffled creaking on the floor below, and thought I could barely distinguish voices in conversation. A moment later, I felt less sure that the deeper sounds were voices, since the apparent hoarse bar was human speech. Then I thought with renewed force of what the factory inspector had heard in the night in this mouldering and pestilential building. Having filled my pockets with the flashlight's aid, I put on my hat and tiptoed to the windows to consider chances of descent. Despite the state's safety regulations, there was no fire escape on this side of the hotel, and I saw that my windows commanded only a sheer 3-story drop to the cobbled courtyard. On the right and left, however, some ancient brick business blocks abutted on the hotel, their slant roofs coming up to a reasonable jumping distance from my 4th-story level. To reach either of these lines of buildings, I would have to be in a room 2 stories from my own, in one case on the north and in the other case on the south, and my mind instantly set to work calculating what chances I had of making the transfer. I could not, I decided, risk an emergence into the corridor, where my footsteps would surely be heard and where the difficulties of entering the desired room would be insuperable. Ooh, I've never heard that word before. Insuperable. My progress, if it was to be made at all, would have to be through the less solidly built connecting doors of the rooms, the locks and bolts of which I would have to force violently, using my shoulder as a battering ram whenever they were set against me. I don't think any of the other connecting doors are locked. This I thought would be possible owing to the rickety nature of the house and its fixtures, but I realized I could not do it noiselessly. I would have to count on sheer speed and the chance of getting to a window before any hostile forces became coordinated enough to open the right door towards me with a passkey. My own outer door I reinforced by pushing the bureau against it, little by little, in order to make a minimum of sound. I perceived that my chances were very slender and was fully prepared for any calamity. Even getting to another roof would not solve the problem, for there would remain then the task of reaching the ground and escaping from the town. One thing in my favor was the deserted and ruinous state of the abutting buildings, and the number of skylights gaping blackly open in each row. Gathering from the grocery boy's map that the best route out of town was southwards, I glanced first at the connecting door on the south side of the room. It was designed to open in my direction, hence I saw, after drawing the bolt and finding other fastenings in place, it was not a favorable one for forcing. Accordingly, abandoning it as a route, I cautiously moved to the bedstead against it to hamper any attack. I cautiously moved the bedstead against it to hamper any attack which might be made on it later from the next door. The door on the north was hung to open away from me, and this, though a test proved it to be locked or bolted from the other side, I knew must be my route. If I could gain the roofs of the buildings in Payne Street and descend successfully to the ground level, I might perhaps dart through the courtyard and the adjacent or opposite buildings to Washington or Bates, or else emerge in Payne and edge around southwards into Washington. In any case, I would aim to strike Washington somehow and get quickly out of the town square region. My preference would be to avoid Payne, since the fire station there might be open all night. Excuse me. I'm really tired, really sleepy. But is he gonna get out? Of course he's gonna get out. Okay. As I thought of these things, I looked out of the squalid sea of decaying roofs below me, now brightened by the beams of a moon not much past full. On the right, the black gash of the river gorge clove the panorama, abandoned factories and railway station clinging barnacle-like to its sides. Beyond it, the rusted railway and the Rowley Road left off through a flat, marshy terrain dotted with islets of higher and drier scrub-grown land. On the left, the creek-threaded countryside was nearer, the narrow road to Ipswich gleaming white in the moonlight. I could not see from my side of the hotel the southwards route towards Arkham, which I had determined to take. I was irresolutely speculating on when I had better attack the northward store, and on how I could least audibly manage it, when I noticed that the vague noises underfoot had given place to a fresh and heavier creaking of the stairs. A wavering flicker of light showed through my transom, and the boards of the corridor began to groan with a ponderous load. Muffled sounds of possible vocal origin approached, and at length a firm knock came at my outer door. Don't do that. Don't knock at my door. For a moment, I simply held my breath and waited. Eternities seemed to elapse, and the nauseous fishy odor of my environment seemed to mount suddenly and spectacularly. Then the knocking was repeated, continuously and with growing insistence. I knew that the time for action had come, and forthwith drew the bolt of the northwards connecting door, bracing myself for the task of battering it open. The knocking waxed louder, and I hoped that its volume would cover the sound of my efforts. At last beginning my attempt, I lunged again and again at the thin paneling with my left shoulder, heedless of shock or pain. The door resisted even more than I had expected, but I did not give in. And all the while, the clamor at the outer door increased. That's scary. Finally, the connecting door gave, but with such a crash that I knew those outside must have heard. Instantly, the outside knocking became a violent battering, while keys sounded ominously in the hall doors of the rooms on both sides of me. Rushing through the newly opened connection, I succeeded in bolting the northerly hall door before the lock could be turned. But even as I did so, I heard the hall door of the third room, the one from whose window I had hoped to reach the roof below, being tried with a passkey. For an instant, I felt absolute despair, since my trapping in a chamber with no window egress seemed complete. A wave of almost abnormal horror swept over me, and invested with a terrible but unexplainable singularity the flashlight glimpsed dust prints made by the intruder who had lately tried my door from this room. Then, with a dazed automatism which persisted despite hopelessness, I made for the next connecting door and performed the blind motion of pushing at it in an effort to get through, and, granting that the fastenings might be as providentially intact as in the second room, bolt the hall door beyond before the lock could be turned from the outside. Sheer fortunate chance gave me my reprieve, for the connecting door before me was not only unlocked, but actually ajar. In a second I was through, and had my right knee and shoulder against a hall door which was visibly opening inward. My pressure took the opener off guard, for the thing shut as I pushed, so that I could slip the well-conditioned bolt as I had done with the other door. As I gained this respite, I heard the battering at the two other doors abate, while a confused clatter came from the connecting door I had shielded with the bedstead. Evidently, the bulk of my assailants had entered a southerly room and were massing in a lateral attack. But at the same moment, a passkey sounded in the next door to the north, and I knew that a nearer peril was at hand. The northwards connecting door was wide open, but there was no time to think about checking the already turning lock in the hall. All I could do was to shut and bolt the opening connecting door, as well as its mate on the opposite side, pushing a bedstead against the one and a bureau against the other, and moving a washstand in front of the hall door. I must, I saw, try to such makeshift barriers to shield me till I could get out the window and on the roof of the Payne Street block. But even in this acute moment, my chief horror was something apart from the immediate weakness of my defenses. I was shuddering because not one of my pursuers, despite some hideous pantings, gruntings, and subdued barkings at odd intervals, was uttering an unmuffled or intelligible vocal sound. Hi. As I moved the furniture and rushed towards the windows, I heard a frightful scurrying along the corridor towards the room north of me, and perceived that the southwards battering had ceased. Plainly, most of my opponents were about to concentrate against the feeble connecting door, which they knew must open directly on me. Outside, the moon played on the ridge-pole of the block below, and I saw that the jump would be desperately hazardous because of the steep surface on which I must land. Surveying the conditions, I chose the more southerly of the two windows as my avenue of escape, planning to land on the inner slope of the roof and make for the nearest skylight. Once inside one of the decrepit brick structures, I would have to reckon with pursuit, but I hoped to descend and dodge in and out of yawning doorways along the shadowed courtyards, eventually getting to Washington Street and slipping out of town towards the south. The clatter at the northerly connecting door was now terrific, and I saw that the weak paneling was beginning to splinter. Obviously, the besiegers had brought some ponderous object into play as a battering ram. The bedstead, however, still held firm, so that I had at least a faint chance of making good my escape. As I opened the window, I noticed that it was flanked by heavy velour draperies, suspended from a pole by brass rings, and also that there was a large projecting catch for the shutters on the exterior. Seeing a possible means of avoiding the dangerous jump, I yanked at the hangings and brought them down, pole and all, then quickly hooking two of the rings in the shutter catch and flinging the drapery outside. The heavy folds reached fully to the abutting roof, and I saw that the rings and catch would be likely to bear my weight. So, climbing out of the window and down the improvised rope ladder, I left behind me forever the morbid and horror-infested fabric of the Gilman house. I landed safely on the loose slats of the steep roof and succeeded in gaining the gaping black skylight without a slip. Glancing up at the window I had left, I observed it was still dark, though far across the crumbling chimneys to the north I could see lights ominously blazing in the order of Dagon Hall, the Baptist church, and the Congregational church which I recalled so shiveringly. There had seemed to be no one in the courtyard below, and I hoped there would be a chance to get away before the spreading of a general alarm. Flashing my pocket lamp into the skylight, I saw that there were no steps down. The distance was slight, however, so I clambered over the brink and dropped, striking a dusty floor littered with crumbling boxes and barrels. The place was ghoulish-looking, but I was past minding such impressions and made at once for the staircase revealed by my flashlight, after a hasty glance at my watch, which showed the hour to be 2 a.m. The steps creaked, but seemed tolerably sound as I raced down past a barn-like second story to the ground floor. The desolation was complete, and only echoes answered my footfalls. At length, I reached the lower hall at one end of which I saw a faint luminous rectangle marking the ruined Payne Street doorway. Heading the other way, I found the back door also open and darted out and down 5 stone steps to the grass-grown cobblestones of the courtyard. Ugh. How's everyone's day? How's everyone being for Halloween? I'm being a pirate. So excited. Maybe I'll stream in costume. Maybe not though, because we're going to hand out candy and then we're going to go to a bar. Am I a real person? Yes. What else would I be? Hi. Hi. Of course I'm a real person. How grown up my roots are. Come on. The moonbeams did not reach down here, but I could just see my way about without using the flashlight. Some of the windows on the Gilman house side were faintly glowing, and I thought I heard confused sounds from within. I fell asleep listening to your story. It was nice. Oh, that's great. Thanks, and thank you to whoever just followed me. I appreciate that. Walking softly over to the Washington Street side, I perceived several open doorways and chose the nearest as my route out. The hallway inside was black, and when I reached the opposite end, I saw that the street door was wedged immovably shut. Resolved to try another building, I groped my way back towards the courtyard, but stopped short when close to the doorway. For out of an open door in the Gilman house, a large crowd of doubtful shapes was pouring, lanterns bobbing in the darkness, and horrible croaking voices exchanging low cries in what was certainly not English. The figures moved uncertainly, and I realized, to my relief, that they did not know where I had gone, but for all that they sent a shiver of horror through my frame. Their features were indistinguishable, but their crouching, shambling gait was abominably repellent. And worst of all, I perceived that one figure was strangely robed and unmistakably surmounted by a tall tiara of a design altogether too familiar. As the figure spread throughout the courtyard, I felt my fears increase. Suppose I could find no egress from this building on the street side. The fishy odor was detestable, and I wondered I could stand it without fainting. Again groping towards the street, I opened a door off the hall and came upon an empty room with closely shuttered but sashless windows, and in another moment had climbed outside and was carefully closing the aperture in its original manner. I was now in Washington Street, and for a moment saw no living thing nor any light save that of the moon. From several directions in the distance, however, I could hear the sound of hoarse voices, of footsteps, and of a curious kind of pattering which did not quite sound like footsteps. Plainly, I had no time to lose. The points of the compass were clear to me, and I was glad that all the street lights were turned off, as is often the custom on strongly moonlit nights in unprosperous rural regions. Some of the sounds came from the south, yet I retained my design of escaping in that direction. There would, I knew, be plenty of deserted doorways to shelter me in case I met any person or group who looked like pursuers. I walked rapidly, softly, and close to the ruined houses. While hatless and disheveled after my arduous climb, I did not look especially noticeable, and stood a good chance of passing unheeded if forced to encounter any casual wayfarer. At Bates Street, I drew into a yawning vestibule while 2 shambling figures crossed in front of me, but was soon on my way again and approaching the open space where Elliott Street obliquely crosses Washington at the intersection of South. Though I had never seen this space, it had looked dangerous to me on the grocery youth's map, since the moonlight would have free play there. There was no use trying to evade it, for any alternative course would involve detours of possibly disastrous visibility and delaying effect. The only thing to do was to cross it boldly and openly, imitating the typical shamble of the Innsmouth folk as best I could, and trusting that no one, or at least no pursuer of mine, would be there. But do you not think everyone in Innsmouth is pursuing him? Because clearly they're going to sacrifice him. Hi, baby. Oh, he's stretching. Just how fully the pursuit was organized, and indeed just what its purpose might be, I could form no idea. I'll tell you what it is. They're going to sacrifice you, baby. There seemed to be unusual activity in the town, but I judged that the news of my escape from the Gilman had not yet spread. I would, of course, soon have to shift from Washington to some other southward street, for for that party from the hotel would doubtless be after me. I must have left dust prints in that last old building, revealing how I had gained the street. The open space was, as I had expected, strongly moonlit, and I saw the remains of a park-like iron-railed green in its center. Fortunately, no one was about, though a curious sort of buzz or roar seemed to be increasing in the direction of Town Square. South Street was very wide, leading directly down a slight declivity to the waterfront and commanding a long view out at sea, and I hoped that no one would be glancing up from it afar as I crossed in the bright moonlight. My brain was just buffering for a second there. My progress was unimpeded, and no fresh sound arose to hint that I had been spied. Glancing about me, I involuntarily let my pace slacken for a second to take in the sight of the sea, gorgeous in the burning moonlight at the street's end. Far out beyond the breakwater was the dim, dark line of Devil Reef, and as I glimpsed it, I could not help thinking of all the hideous legends I had heard in the last 34 hours. Legends which portrayed this ragged rock as a veritable gateway to realms of unfathomed horror and inconceivable abnormality. Then, without warning, I saw the intermittent flashes of light on the distant reef. They were definite and unmistakable, and awakened in my mind a blind horror beyond all rational proportion. My muscles tightened for panic flight, held in only by a certain unconscious caution and half-hypnotic fascination. And to make matters worse, there now flashed forth from the lofty cupola of the Gilman house, which loomed up to the northeast behind me, a series of analogous, though differently spaced gleams, which could be nothing less than an answering signal. The bat signal. Controlling my muscles and realizing afresh how plainly visible I was, I resumed my brisker and faintly shambling pace, though keeping my eyes on that hellish and ominous reef as long as the opening of South Street gave me a seaward view. What the whole proceeding meant I could not imagine, unless it involved some strange rite connected with Devil Reef, or unless some party had landed from a ship on that sinister rock. I now bent to the left around the ruinous green, still gazing towards the ocean as it blazed in the spectral summer moonlight, and watching the cryptical flashing of those nameless, unexplainable beacons. It was then that the most horrible impression of all was borne in upon me, the impression which destroyed my last vestige of self-control and sent me running frantically southwards past the yawning black doorways and fishily staring windows of that deserted nightmare street. For at a closer glance I saw that the moonlit waters between the reef and the shore were far from empty. They were alive with a teeming horde of shapes, swimming inwards towards the town, and even at my vast distance and in my single moment of perception, I could tell that the bobbing heads and flailing arms were alien and aberrant in a way scarcely to be expressed or consciously formulated. My frantic running ceased before I had covered a block, for at my left I began to hear something like the hue and cry of organized pursuit. There were footsteps and guttural sounds, and a rattling motor wheezed south along Federal Street. In a second, all my plans were utterly changed, for, if the southward highway were blocked ahead of me, I must clearly find another egress from Innsmouth. I paused and drew into a gaping doorway, reflecting how lucky I was to have left the moonlit open space before these pursuers came down the parallel street. A second reflection was less comforting. Since the pursuit was down another street, it was plain that the party was not following me directly. It had not seen me, but was simply obeying a general plan for cutting off my escape. This, however, implied that all roads leading out of Innsmouth were similarly patrolled, for the people could not have known what route I intended to take. If this were so, I would have to make my retreat across country, away from any road. But how could I do that in view of the marshy and creek-riddled nature of all the surrounding region? For a moment my brain reeled, both from sheer hopelessness and from a rapid increase in the omnipresent fishy odor. Then I thought of the abandoned railway to Rowley, whose solid line of ballasted, weed-growth earth still stretched off to the northwest from the crumbling station on the edge of the river gorge. There was just a chance I would not think of it, about how it lay. Most of its earlier length was uncomfortably visible from Rowley Road and from high places in the town itself, but one could, perhaps, crawl inconspicuously through the undergrowth. At any rate, it would form my only chance of deliverance, and there was nothing to do but try it. Drawing inside the hall of my deserted shelter, I once more consulted the grocery boy's map with the aid of the flashlight. The immediate problem was how to reach the ancient railway, and I now saw that the safest course was ahead to Babson Street, then west to Lafayette, there edging around but not crossing an open space homologous to the one I had traversed, and subsequently back northwards and westwards in a zigzagging line through Lafayette, Bates, Adams, and Bank Streets, the latter skirting the river gorge, to the abandoned and dilapidated station I had seen from my window. My reason for going ahead to Babson was that I wished neither to recross the earlier open space, nor to begin my westward course along a cross street as broad as south. Okay. It's not where we're ending. We're going to finish it. I'm just going to take a sip of water and just take a break. So I don't know if any of you have tried to read for an hour plus aloud, but it's a lot. So let's power through. Starting once more, I crossed the street to the right-hand side in order to edge around into Babson as inconspicuously as possible. Noises still continued in Federal Street, and as I glanced behind me, I thought I saw a gleam of light near the building through which I had escaped. Anxious to leave Washington Street, I broke into a quiet dog trot, trusting to luck not to encounter any observing eye. Next to the corner of Babson Street, I saw to my alarm that one of the houses was still inhabited, as attested by curtains at the window, but there were no lights within, and I passed it without disaster. I wish I had something to put my hair up with. It's just bothering me. In Babson Street, which crossed Federal and might thus reveal me to the searchers, I clung as closely as possible to the sagging, uneven buildings, twice pausing in a doorway as the noises behind me momentarily increased. The open space ahead shone wide and desolate under the moon, but my route would not force me to cross it. During my second pause, I began to detect a fresh distribution of vague sounds, and upon looking cautiously out from the cover, beheld a motor car darting across the open space, bound outward along Elliott Street, which there intersects both Babson and Lafayette. As I watched, choked by a sudden rise in the fishy odor after a short abatement, I saw a band of uncouth, crouching shapes loping and shambling in the same direction, and knew that this must be the party guarding the Ipswich Road, since that highway forms an extension of Elliott Street. Two of the figures I glimpsed were in voluminous robes, and one wore a peaked diadem which glistened whitely in the moonlight. The gait of this figure was so odd that it sent a chill through me, for it seemed to me the creature was almost hopping. Like a fish out of water, huh? When the last of the band was out of sight, I resumed my progress, darting around the corner into Lafayette Street, and crossing Elliott very hurriedly, lest stragglers of the party be still advancing along that thoroughfare. I did hear some croaking and clattering sounds far off towards Town Square, but accomplished the passage without disaster. My greatest dread was in recrossing broad and moonlit South Street, with its seaward view, and I had to nerve myself for the ordeal. Someone might easily be looking, and possible Elliott Street stragglers could not fail to glimpse me from either of 2 points. At the last moment, I decided I had better slacken my trot and make the crossing as before, in the shambling gait of an average Innsmouth native. When the view of the water again opened out, this time to my right, I was half determined not to look at it at all. I could not, however, resist, but cast a sidelong glance as I carefully and imitatively shambled towards the protecting shadows ahead. There was no ship visible, as I had half expected there would be. Instead, the first thing which caught my eye was a small rowboat pulling in towards the abandoned wharves and laden with some bulky, tarpaulin-covered object. Its rowers, though distantly and indistinctly seen, were of an especially repellent aspect. Several swimmers were still discernible, while on the far black reef I could see a faint, steady glow, unlike the winking beacon visible before me, and of a curious color which I could not precisely identify. Above the slant roofs ahead and to the right, there loomed the There loomed the tall cupola of the Gilman house, but it was completely dark. The fishy odor, dispelled for a moment by some merciful breeze, now closed in again with maddening intensity. I had not quite crossed the street when I heard a muttering band advancing along Washington from the north. As they reached the broad open space where I had had my first disquieting glimpse of the moonlit water, I could see them plainly only a block away, and was horrified by the bestial abnormality of their faces and the dog-like subhumanness of their crouching gait. One man moved in a positively simian way, with long arms frequently touching the ground, while another figure, robed and tiaraed, seemed to progress in an almost hopping fashion. I judged this party to be the one I had seen in the Gilman's courtyard, the one, therefore, most closely on my trail. Oh, my hairs make my face itchy. As some of the figures turned to look in my direction, I was transfixed with fright, yet managed to preserve the casual shambling gait I had assumed. To this day, I do not know whether they saw me or not. If they did, my stratagem must have deceived them, for they passed on across the moonlit space without varying their course. Meanwhile, croaking and jabbering in some hateful, guttural patois I could not identify. Once more in shadow, I resumed my former dog trot past the leaning and decrepit houses that stared blankly into the night. Having crossed to the western sidewalk, I rounded the nearest corner into Bates Street, where I kept close to the buildings on the southern side. I passed 2 houses, showing signs of habitation, one of which had faint lights in upper rooms, yet met with no obstacle. As I turned into Adams Street, I felt measurably safer, but received a shock when a man reeled out of a black doorway directly in front of me. He proved, however, too hopelessly drunk to be a menace, God bless, so that I reached the dismal ruins of the Bank Street warehouses in safety. No one was stirring in that dead street beside the river gorge.